On this episode of China Unscripted, what the Biden administration keeps getting wrong about China, how communist ideology is crippling America's response to China, and what the U.S. needs to do to stop it. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Dinesta.
And joining us today is Brad Thayer, Director of China Policy at the Center for Security Policy. Brad, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to join you today.
Well, yeah, I'm excited to talk to you because I know you talk a lot about the ideology of communism, the Chinese Communist Party. And, I think it was interesting. During the Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about this being an ideological battle. Mike Pompeo talked about that a lot. But with the Biden administration, that conversation has pretty much entirely dropped, even when they are talking about China as a threat to the U.S. It's never brought to the realm of ideology. Why do you think focusing on communist ideology is so important to the discussion about China?
Because it defines the essence of the division. It explains why the Chinese Communist Party is aggressive. In order to understand the actions of the CCP, you need to understand their ideology of communism. And communism, as it's interpreted by the Chinese Communist Party, is ultimately Leninist, and that is inherently an aggressive ideology. So in order to understand the causes of conflict between the United States and China, or if you will, the U.S. and its allies in China, we need to understand its ideology. We also need to understand the importance of ideology. Ideology tells you who your friends are, who your enemies are. It tells you for what you're fighting and why you're fighting. It's a motivator as well. In the West, of course, with our political ideology of liberalism, this is a legitimate ideology because it relies on the consent of the people. Focusing on ideology allows us to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is illegitimate because it does not rely on the consent of the people. So the ideological lens is extremely important to understand to get to the fundamental causes of the tension that exists, the Cold War, which presently exists between the United States and its allies and the Chinese Communist Party.
Why would you say that there hasn't been so much of a focus on the ideology?
With the Biden administration, I think it has because the Biden administration seeks to have a focus on the importance of maintaining the engagement school of thought, that is to maintain trade relationships with China. The Biden administration is the last gasp, in my mind, of the old regime. These are guys who are going back and trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together to try to return it to the happy time that existed for the engagement school in the 90s and in the noughties and until the Trump administration. So from that point of view, of course, to recognize the ideological origins of the conflict would compel them to recognize the differences are insuperable. The CCP is an evil regime. It's odious in every respect, and yet you want to trade with it. So it's far better for the Biden administration not to call attention to that ideological dimension. It also, I think the Biden administration is minimizing it as well because to focus on that would require them to take far more measures to essentially restrict trade, restrict technology transfer, and to go about really marshaling our alliances, our alliance network in the Indo-Pacific in a way that the Biden administration has been reluctant to do.
Well, so the Biden administration wants to continue trade and so is reluctant to point out ideology. But during the Trump administration, Trump had repeatedly talked about a trade deal, signed a trade deal in January 2020 with China, while at the same time, his Secretary of State Pompeo was talking about ideology.
Yes.
So can those two things coexist?
Well, there's an inherent tension there. And we want to remember our Voltaire that the perfect is the enemy of the good enough, right? The Trump administration was not perfect in its approach to China, but it was far better than the engagement school, which defined previous American presidents. So yes, Trump did want trade agreements, particularly on soybeans or particularly on agricultural products and other areas. At the same time, I think the Trump administration, Pompeo, others, Matt Pottinger, many others in the Trump administration recognized the ideological nature of the conflict and its insuperable. I think the essence of it, of course, the differences are insuperable. So that tension did exist in the Trump administration. We'll have to see, of course, but the Trump administration was far better, infinitely better than the Biden administration and its return to the failed policies of the engagement school.
How would you say, let's say you were suddenly being put in charge of like the State Department, something like that, and now you have to explain to the American people the, ideological issues at play between the US and China. What would you say?
Well, certainly, it's a very important issue that the United States has a political tradition. It has an ideology which stands for maximizing freedom of the American people, of liberty, and supporting those elements around the world. In contrast, the CCP is obviously definitive of tyranny, an ideology which is aggressive, which oppresses the Chinese people. It permits and justifies genocide against Muslims, Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, and Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. It's defined by gross human rights abuses. It is an entity which will never go through a civil rights movement, for example. That would even be unthinkable in China. The United States was able to correct many of its flaws by going through a civil rights movement to provide greater opportunity for women, for greater opportunity for racial and sexual minorities. Those are elements which are unthinkable in China controlled by the CCP. So if we look at the ideological origins of this conflict, it allows us to see that fundamental difference between the United States and its political tradition of liberalism, small l, that is the ideology of political liberalism, versus the brutality and the absolutely inhuman nature of communism. There's a reason why refugees want to come to the West, and they're not seeking to get to China, right? And we often vote with our feet, as Bertolt Brecht originally said, right? It's quite clear that empirically, if you look around the world, the West is essentially the location of choice for the world's refugee population, because those individuals know that those societies will treat them better than China, which is definitive, of course, of human rights abuses, of religious abuse, political abuse, of course, and the most coercive practices directed against its own population. I think those points are important to make when we're conveying to global audiences, but also to the American people themselves, that we're in this ideological struggle, and it is a test, much like the Cold War was a test between Soviet communism and broadly Western liberalism. So too, we're in essentially the new Cold War, where that ideological component is definitive of it. And it allows us to understand why we need to win the conflict. Because the dispositive question of the 21st century is going to be, is there still a future for freedom in international politics? Is there still a champion for freedom, or is freedom in retrograde, essentially, and the future of tyranny will be essentially the future of will be the dominant political force and ideology of the 21st century. So that dispositive question is being answered right now, and it's very important for people to understand the stakes that are at the root of it.
Well, I think one of the challenges of discussing ideology with an American audience is that a lot of people will look at China and say, yes, it is authoritarian. Yes, what they're doing is evil, but they're not communist. And there's this disconnect between authoritarianism and what communism really is. So how would you make that distinction?
Well, I would say that they're totalitarian, and that the communism is a totalitarian ideology. It's not going to tolerate alternative ideologies. It's not going to determine essentially a political choice. It seeks to maintain itself in power in perpetuity. And so when we're thinking through that, and that's a common distinction, well, the Chinese are bad, but they're not really communists. Well, I think that's fundamentally wrong, that the Chinese Communist Party is indeed a communism, and understanding the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and then through Leninism and Stalinism gives us great insight into the activity of the Comintern, and gives us great insight into those who were advising the Chinese Communist Party, governing the Chinese Communist Party, and on Mao's thoughts historically. So it's extremely important to understand that. And when we do, we'll understand, of course, that compromise with them is not going to be possible because they are locked into an existential crisis. We talked about ideology before. For communists, of course, having that external foe, internal foes, of course, are absolutely critical to have, but also that external foe, the capitalist West or the United States specifically, are very important for a regime which fundamentally is illegitimate and it seeks to use enemies, internal or domestic, to essentially have an element or a grasp on a claim to legitimacy. So when we look at it, it's not authoritarian. You have at root, this is the Chinese Communist Party, which is, again, a Leninist one, and it is one which is seeking to advance that Leninist agenda, which is to spread its power, to engage and to defeat all other ideologies, most important of which, of course, would be the United States.
Well, so you talk about how the Communist Party, is always trying to maintain power and suppress its political opponents. But if you look at political parties in the West, whether it's the Democrats and Republicans, or another country you have Labor, conservative, liberal parties, Green parties, they're all trying to maximize power for themselves.
But not
right?
like with rape as a form of torture.
Right. Well, so, this is what I wanted to get into, right? Is like, besides obviously that, what is fundamentally different about the Communist Party versus the political parties you see in Western liberal democracies?
Because it's a very important question. Western liberal democracies are informed, first of all, by Western civilization, which has respect for individuals as individuals, whether that's coming out of a traditional Catholic interpretation through a European identity when it was Christendom, or whether it's coming through a democratic socialist, which of course is very important in the European context, or a liberal context, very important, of course, in Canada, the UK, United States, and France. So there's a respect for individuals, and there's a recognition that the state does have limits. The state can do certain things, certainly, and should do certain things, but it must respect the autonomy of individuals and individual rights and the dignities of individuals. And support or tolerate freedom. Individuals have certain rights which are given to them. It's recognized, of course, by very famously the French Revolution or the American Revolution, and it's the job of the state to essentially maintain those rights. Of course, there's a context within that, and there's a give and take, obviously, and that has been interpreted in different ways, of course, over the context of Western political history. But nonetheless, that's far superior to Leninism, right, or to the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, which does not recognize that. It is a Leninist ideology, which says, of course, it is the vanguard of the proletariat or the workers and the peasants. Party rules in their name. And there can be, under democratic centralism, of course, there can be debate at highest levels of the party, but once the party decides, that is it. That is a system which is prone to abuse, and we have seen the worst human rights abuses come out of that ideology, whether it's the Khmer Rouge or whether it's the Chinese Communist Party under Mao or subsequently, or Stalin and its interpretation, or the Eastern European knockoffs of Stalinism. We've seen just horrible, the worst human rights abuses coming out of that type of system. You don't have that in the West because there are checks. There are a context which recognizes the value of individuals, which is absent, of course, in any type of communist system.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Khmer Rouge because I remember when one of the top leaders was on trial, he was saying he was fighting for social justice. And that is the twisted. That's why talking about ideology is important, I think, because there's a lot of people who will say, "Oh, like the United States is just as bad, if not worse, than China." And there's this idea because it is part of the ideological battle where people are being educated to think that communism is about social justice. How is that a bad thing versus American capitalism, war for oil, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, certainly, but that, of course, is a misinterpretation of social communists. Of course, when they're out of power, when they're seeking to get into power, of course, have all sorts of. The Chinese Communist Party were agrarian reformers, right? They were sold as that, or Lenin said, "Bread, land, peace." Right? That is what the objectives of the Bolsheviks were. Once in power, of course, they're totalitarian, and they very rapidly move to secure it, and they kill their enemies. And it's that brutal. And you know very quickly which way the wind is blowing. If you're going to resist them, of course, the communists will be coming for you. And that has led to the abuses that we saw, of course, in Soviet history and in Chinese history and elsewhere. We could go into Mengistu's rule in Ethiopia or the Khmer Rouge, of course, or MPLA in Angola. Right, we can go around the globe to see the nature of those abuses. It's inherent in the ideology. So wherever it shows up, you're going to have those types of abuses. Now, that can be contrasted, I think, empirically. Again, look around the world and see what the United States has done, despite the flaws and mistakes it has made in global politics. It is a very positive force for advancing conceptions of individual rights, the rights of women around the world, the rights of racial minorities, the rights of sexual minorities, in a way, of course, which would be bourgeois, obviously, for communists. So I think let's look empirically, and I think you can look at the record of the West, if you will, broadly, and you can look at the record of communist states, and it is essentially a very clear situation in terms of which society most individuals are going to want to live if they're given a choice, clearly. Obviously, the CCP doesn't give people a choice, and so that's in large measure the cause of the problems that China faces today.
You mentioned that the Biden administration you see as the last gasp of an old regime, the engagement school way of looking at China and the CCP. When we talk about people being misled about not understanding the ideology of communism or the Communist Party, we aren't talking about, in this case, 19-year-old university students. We're talking about, people who have come up through the government who have been dealing with foreign policy for decades. How did this happen that they could completely ignore that ideological basis you're talking about?
Well, it's a very curious issue how they could completely ignore it, or how they could ignore the principles of strategy, which would govern and should govern American foreign policy. And the first rule of which, of course, is don't assist your adversary. Well, the engagement school has done almost everything that it could to aid the CCP. So it's a very important issue. I think Jim Fennell and I are finishing a book actually on this topic, which is looking at how could this happen? How is it that the United States could go from the success of the defeat of the Soviet Union, let's say 1991, to the situation today where we have a peer competitor? And how could that happen? Well, it's a very interesting and very complicated story, but a big part of it is that our elites in the foreign policy and economic communities were divorced from strategy. They were divorced from an understanding of what communism was. There was an end of history moment, right, which was a very powerful motivator, which allowed us to understand that there were no longer going to be great power conflicts, that we were moving in that, as Fukuyama identified, in that Hegelian sense, history had resolved itself. We knew that capitalism and liberal democracy were the essentially best form of polity, and so ideological conflicts were going to fall away. But also Deng Xiaoping's very successful political warfare strategy, where he was able to make the American elite and Western elites broadly his partner. That what he did is he recognized that you could buy the American elite essentially, and you could buy them for very little money, as it turned out, and by allowing them to have handsome returns to their investments, they would become your partners, they would become your defender, and you would use their power to gain additional influence in the halls of Congress, of course, in the American, or with our media, obviously, foundations, think tanks, etc. So it's an issue we've thought a lot about when we're reflecting on how this could happen. How is it that the United States could assist the rise of its peer without ever balancing against it? Now, external elements are relevant there too. 9/11, of course, had an important role to play. But it was a supremely successful case of what we term threat deflation, where Deng and then obviously his successors went out of their way to minimize the threat that they were seen to pose by also working with elites around the world to also help minimize the conception that China was communist or that China was a threat, right? It was, after all, Fukuyama said, we're all on the road to the end of history. We're all on the road to liberal democracy. So the Chinese might have a little bit of some stickiness, right, in moving along that path, but ultimately they'd get there, right? And that led to a lot of self-justification and rationalization, I think, for tremendous amounts of investment in the PRC, which sadly continues to this day. So I hope to be back, and perhaps when the book is out, of course, we could have a discussion on that very interesting topic as well.
Maybe we could get you and Jim on at the same time. That'd be fun. But so this is why I think it's important to talk about communist ideology in this way, because a lot of people, if they talk about communism, it's Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. But I know you take the time to also talk about the Frankfurt School and Gramsci and so give us that side of the story.
Well, certainly very influential. Gramsci and the Frankfurt School independently recognized communism was not going to come to the West based on a revolution on the factory floor. Western conditions were very different. The conditions of working people, the working class in the West, was very different from the way it was in Russia or elsewhere around the world. And so both of those groups, Gramsci with his own thought, and then the Frankfurt School alighting into Marcuse, alighting into really what we would call critical theory, adopt a different approach, which was you need to focus on ideas, and you need to focus on the ideas industry. And where are ideas manufactured? Well, in the West, they're manufactured at universities. They're manufactured in film. They're manufactured in what was called also the culture industry. That would be radio, of course, television, popular music, many different avenues. And if you could advance messages that were not explicitly communist, but in fact were operating through front organizations or elsewhere, you would be able to essentially advance communism through stalking horses, for example, social justice, or other terms that sound very pleasing and right, and that are fully in accord and resonate with liberals. Again, small l, those who believe in political liberalism. And so in those ways, you would be able to advance communist thought, not explicitly, again, through communism, but through progressive thought, right? It would be, again, that those who are right-thinking, those who are on the cusp or in the vanguard of history will subscribe to those beliefs. And so by seizing the ideas industry, you're able to bring about a change without seizing obviously capitalism or the banks or that those types of elements, you would be able to influence your students. You'd be able to influence literature. You'd be able to influence the intellectual classes. And then from there, over time, you would be able to, as Gramsci said, you would conduct your long march through the institutions by having these ideas spread throughout the totality of the cultural life, economic life, political life of a society. So communism would come not through a violent revolution, if you will. It would come on cat's paws, right? It would come in like fog in the night, but nonetheless, it would be successful in bringing about its revolution of destroying bourgeois life and replacing bourgeois life with essentially the communist preferred option. So very different types of approach, and very important to understand for understanding how communism has advanced in the West, and heavily influenced, of course, by Marcuse's ideas about repressive tolerance, that you do not tolerate ideas which are intolerant, right? Which was Marcuse's way of saying you don't tolerate essentially the respect for the First Amendment, the respect for intellectual debate, freedom of speech. You tolerate only ideas which are progressive, by nature communist. And those are only the ideas that you're going to allow. And so you very rapidly shrink any type of what we would understand in liberal thought, of course, the importance of debate, the importance of intellectual exchange, and a marketplace of ideas is obviously a product of bourgeois ideology for Marcuse. And what is necessary is to advance that communist revolution by only permitting proper thoughts, politically correct thoughts, to be advanced in culture, obviously, and then that would seep into other aspects, economic life, political life. And it has been very effective, really, at serving as the rocket fuel, if you will, for American progressives today.
Well, so you mentioned the Frankfurt School is pushing ideas, including social justice, which is something that many Americans find to be a positive thing. What is the link between social justice and communist ideology?
Well, the link is, of course, communists would not tolerate social justice in the way that term would be used, perhaps, by progressives today when they're talking about social justice or equity. What that is used is that is simply a tactical tool, right? I mean, that is going to be used because it sounds pleasing, it sounds positive, it sounds progressive. Who could oppose social justice, right? No one could oppose social justice. But behind that, of course, tactic is the strategy of communism to essentially remove the linchpin of Western societies. So when we're thinking through communist thought, of course, communists are expert at waging political warfare, right? Engaging in that because they see they have a revolutionary agenda, and they see that all measures short of violent measures, at least thus far, are legitimate. In political warfare, they can say anything, and they can always position a society to the left, so that by focusing, because you control the ideas industry, media, film, popular culture, you're always going to have that echo chamber where thought about social justice is going to be seen as progressive. And social justice means one thing, right? Ultimately, what the communists want. It doesn't mean, we can think about Plato's Euthyphro, right? Well, what is justice, right? We can get into a discussion, and in a liberal context, you might have that. For communists, of course, that's not, or for progressives today, that's not possible, right? Social justice is something to advance the revolution. It is a cudgel used to beat bourgeois society, to move in a communist direction. It has nothing to do with social justice as essentially the attractiveness of the term, at least superficially, would entail.
So in other words, the communists are using that term, but imbuing it with a different meaning, a revolutionary meaning that has little to do with what we in the West think of as justice.
Absolutely. Everything is permitted for communists, right? When they're waging war against their internal enemies, against their bourgeois enemies, they want to destroy liberal society, right? And replace it with a communist tyranny. And so they allow themselves, as Reagan said, to lie, cheat, steal, whatever. Everything is permitted to them by their own logic. So will use terms that sound very attractive to people and that are enticing. As long as you don't look too deeply at that, I think it can be a very useful tool, as they always have. The term progressive, if you look at that genealogy, you'll see that as well, where the communism, of course, had a bad name in the West, in the United States, but progressivism doesn't, right? Progressivism ties into American political history, the progressive movement. In Wisconsin, obviously, if you will, in the upper Midwest, you had a large number of progressive politicians. And so tying that to progressivism, not saying that you're communist, but saying that you're progressive, is a way to, as a tactical trick, of course, to advance your agenda while not dealing with essentially the true agenda that you're seeking to advance.
It's like hiding ideology in language. Like communists are going to take a term that has one meaning, but the communists see it with a different meaning, and then they promote that idea and slowly imbue it with this communist meaning until the very definition of that word is now different. But it kind of happened like a frog in boiling water.
It's kind of like Xi Jinping talking about China's democracy, and it's the best democracy.
Yes. Yeah. Language, communists are very sensitive to language. Of course, they recognize the power of language. That language helps to feed the ideas that you possess. It allows you to, it can be flavored, it can be influenced either positively or negatively. And so, again, fundamentally, communists are very sensitive to ideas, linguistic approaches, if you will. So they're going to be artful and very creative, and always coming up with a new term. And there's always, again, a crisis, right? That's another tactic that the communists use. There's always an issue. There's always an event. There's always a group which is oppressed. We have to bring about these changes in our society in order to help this group. By the own logic of liberalism, right? These people have been oppressed. They've been mistreated. And therefore, we must devote all of our efforts urgently to bringing about these changes. So we can see in the history of the civil rights movement, segue to the women's rights movement, segue to rights for lesbians and for gays, and then that segued into, if you will, LGBTQ, plus. That segued into trans. Right? There's always a crisis. It's always a way of keeping the liberal society on the back foot. Right? It's never a way of saying, hey, should we make these changes or what are the costs? There's always a crisis that has to be addressed, which they use, again, tactically to advance their revolutionary ends.
So what would you say to somebody, like to an American who wants to understand the difference between this? Because a lot of people do like the idea of social justice. I think most people would say, like, hey, Jim Crow South was not good. How do you determine, like, oh, I'm trying to make things better versus I am now slipping into some communist conspiracy that I have no idea about?
Yeah, I think because, like, what you just said, Brad, could definitely be interpreted as like, oh, well, so was the civil rights movement bad? Was the women's movement bad? Is like every attempt to make things more, equal for people, like, is that a bad thing?
Right. Well, liberal societies have a profound advantage in that they're able to address their flaws in a way with civil rights movement, women's rights movement did. At the same time, those changes were recognized by communists as being ways that they could further their agenda as well. So to draw out that contrast, I think it's very useful to think through, are you focused on individual rights or are you focused on group rights, right? Are you focused on, do you see humans as humans, as individuals whose rights need to be protected? or you're thinking terms of social groups, right? And we were thinking along those lines. I think that allows us to illuminate some differences between a liberal approach, for example, of Martin Luther King, right, who wanted people to be judged on the content of their character, not on the color of their skin, versus progressive ideology today, which is heavily influenced by communist thought and sees individuals as groups. Because you are of this color, you need to play this role, right? So it's that tension. King versus progressives today gives a good way of illuminating that difference between what liberalism would seek to achieve and to reform itself versus, if you will, a communist ideological agenda.
Yeah, I think it's very clear. You mentioned it earlier, the idea of repressive tolerance. Uh, like obviously, like the kind of KKK, white supremacy, lynching people, obviously bad. But now you've gotten to the point where people are calling so many things white supremacy. Drinking coffee is white supremacy. Hard work is white supremacy. Monogamy is even being called white supremacy because that's part of this, white Christian culture promoting monogamous relationships, and like that really
I
kind of
mean,
shows you the
because
creep.
only Christian cultures have monogamous relationships.
It's weird, yeah. This is that kind of creep where there is like this root thing that is bad, but then it somehow just morphs into something completely different.
But doesn't that make it easier for people to think that's just a joke, though? Like, if you hear people
I don't know.
say
I'm sure
drinking coffee is white supremacy, then,
you
I think most people wouldn't take that seriously.
you would think. But remember, in the Cultural Revolution, Mao had kids tearing up grass because grass was bourgeois. And that sounds like a joke, but it became deadly serious.
It can very easily. I mean, the communist aspect is totalitarian, right? And so there's always going to be and again, it's not fettered by any type of safeguards in Western civilization or in religious thought or in respect for individual rights. So it's a very important point. It's a very significant issue. And Americans need to consider this because we're in a period of ideological upheaval where progressivism now is a potent political force and liberalism, again, political liberalism, is under strain in a way that it never has been. I mean, Louis Hartz wrote that great book, The Liberal Tradition in America, right? He wrote that about 1955, where he said America was the home of liberal absolutism, by which he meant liberalism will never be successfully replaced in the United States. There have been contenders, certainly, fascism, communism, as he identified it, the Western agrarian type of Tory life of the American South. And he said liberalism had defeated all of those challengers, right? So in 1955, that you could certainly recognize that was the case, a very powerful and influential book. But today you can see that progressivism is really pushing liberalism in a way that Louis Hartz would not have identified, right? That in fact, America is not a liberal absolutist state. America is undergoing an ideological upheaval today between progressivism, heavily informed by communist thought, and the Hartzian conception of a liberal state. So it's this is a test, obviously, we're undergoing, and we'll see which way, obviously, the country turns.
So, with this spread of progressivism in the United States, which is essentially another face of communism, how do you think that has impacted the United States' approach to China?
I think it's influenced it heavily. I think in the following respects. First, it's influenced it in the sense that progressives are a little bit schizophrenic when it comes to the CCP, in the sense that the CCP violates so many of the elements that American progressivism heavily emphasizes. Rights of minorities, for example, which are absolutely suppressed in the People's Republic of China. But at the same time, that, if you will, they're birds of a feather, that the CCP is a communist entity, and progressivism, if you will, its antecedents or its direct predecessors were heavily influenced by communists. So there's an element of birds of a feather there too, an ideological affinity. But it's a complicated story. It's really the result of coming out of two very different communist traditions. And thank you for bringing up the Gramsci Frankfurt School, that is communism in the West versus more of the Leninist approach that you've had elsewhere, outside of the West, really. Communism is heavily influenced by Leninist thought. And so you see really that type of elements of affinity, but also elements of very significant difference coming out of those two traditions.
You see this kind of discourse sometimes on social media about people talking about how, because the U.S. is a hegemonic power, all of these other nations like the PRC or whatever, it's not as bad as the U.S. when it comes to certain things, and that's why it's worth supporting the CCP or things like that. But also, a lot of times these people get they're not taken seriously in some ways by people on the left who are also would consider themselves progressive, but also, the common term for that is tankies, right? Like somebody who supports the CCP or other left totalitarian regimes, and people who are progressive say they're giving us a bad name. What would you say about this?
Well, I think that's a tension. Again, there's the elements that communism is vulnerable to internecine warfare and different interpretations, as it always has been, if you will, Bolsheviks versus Mensheviks, different interpretations of how to advance the revolution. In the West, Gramsci in the Frankfurt School versus a Leninist, you're going to seize the state through a coup. And these tensions are surfacing, I think, here. So the issue would be progressives value the environment very highly. The CCP does not. Progressives violate minority rights very highly, and rights of women, of course, very highly. The CCP does not. So we could go down a list of tensions, points of tension that exist. At the same time, there's affinity. Purportedly, both are anti-bourgeois, right? In reality, the CCP elite live like billionaires, right? They live they live for themselves, obviously, and their families with incredible luxury, no matter what their ideology says, which is often the case and almost always exclusively the case for communist leaders. Versus progressive thought. So those tensions are going to be there, but also that affinity that they are both attacking bourgeois identities.
Well, there is some affinity because a lot of the elite billionaires in the United States are progressive.
Yes. And why they believe that, of course, I think is a complicated tale and would probably depend on the individual about why he or she believes that. But that's exactly right. They are. And whether they do that simply for tactical reasons, you have to be progressive in order to be, if you will, accepted in many, many different communities in the United States, or they fully believe that and truly believe it. I think that's an empirical issue, but nonetheless, that's exactly right. They are, and they fund it, right? Their money flows. Silicon Valley, obviously, Bay Area. We can simply go around. American elites are strongly supportive of progressivism, but they have not yet been forced to confront those tensions, right? The inherent tensions that are going to exist in their perspective. Do they really want to give up living in Western civilization? And do they really want to give up living in a liberal society? And when they are, I think, faced with that stark question, then perhaps their answers, for some of them at least, might be very different when they're looking at the alternative forms of government, which are going to be not benign, but are going to be very malign and explicitly target the wealthy, right? Explicitly target the rich and explicitly target individual success, right? And what made Elon Musk possible? Well, he was able to come to the United States ultimately, right? He was able to, very intelligent fellow, a lot of great ideas, who was able to turn those great ideas into a classic American success story, right? That wouldn't happen in China, by the way, right? We can, Jack Ma has many virtues and is an incredibly intelligent individual, but if you get crossways of Xi Jinping, you're dancing on a knife's edge there, as he found out. So when you're faced with actually losing Western civilization and losing political liberalism, these individuals, I dare say, would look askance at that. But they have not been forced to confront those contradictions yet, so they can live in the environment that they choose.
I guess I would say that I'm sure we have a lot of viewers who would consider themselves progressive, or politically on the left, and then they
Shelley
would say,
would tell you that you are filthy communists. That's where you're going with this, right, Shelley?
"You're still not going to get me to say it, Chris."
Damn.
But my question is but they would say, I don't like the CCP.
Yeah.
I'm not a communist. Like, are you calling me a communist? Like, I think there would be like a lot of pushback and offense at that.
Well, certainly, and again, a large part of that might be empirical, right? We don't know those individuals, and again, it allows communist parties themselves, right, are particularly odious, and they're usually in the West, at least, a small number of individuals. But they're very highly motivated, and they recognize the advantage of progressivism, right? You're not saying that you're a communist, you're saying that you're progressive. So behind that front organization or the front terminology, you're able to win much more support. So indeed, individuals might think, I'm a progressive, I'm not a communist, right? But they need to think through in their own mind, right, whether the values that they seek, the values that they hold, and the political beliefs, values that they seek to support and to advance, are they ones which are flirting with totalitarianism, or are they ones that are opening a door to greater individual freedom and prosperity? And that would be an issue that I think that all individuals, all Americans should ask and should reflect, as well as having a greater knowledge about the American political tradition, which is a very complicated political tradition. Louis Hart said, well, liberalism is always going to win. But if you actually look at America's political history, of course, we have had different ideologies. We've had many movements and that have been influenced by religion, that have been influenced by political ideologies, that have been influenced by other states, external states. So it's a very complicated political tradition that we possess. And I think if they are knowledgeable about these issues, if they think through those issues, they might find that they are much more in keeping with a Williams Jennings Bryant type of approach, if you will, a progressivism as it was defined in American political tradition in the 1890s or in the early decades of this century, before progressivism, really, as we would understand it as a movement, was captured by or heavily influenced by communists.
I think this is...
Well, I was going to say, what is that progressivism of the 1890s?
Well, the progressivism of the 1890s is that individuals, all individuals, the individual farmer, the individual worker, right? Every individual has to be protected from the abuses of capitalism, from the abuses of, if you will, the fat cats, whether they're in the state capitol or whether they're in Washington or whether they're running the railroad, right? So Brian is coming out of that tradition in the prairies, which is the farmers have to sell to the railroad, right? You got to get your wheat to market, and the railroad is the only way you're going to get it there. And the railroad is saying, we're only going to give you this for that wheat. And so that you're being exploited, and the exploitation is quite raw. They need protection from that so that every individual can live to the best of his or her ability. And that really is at root of a progressive tradition in American political thought The wealthy are suspect, right? The capitalists are suspect. The monopoly capital is going to be suspect, and it's bad for, if you will, the American people as a whole. So if wealth is too concentrated, right, that has to be there has to be pressures or elements push against that. So that's a very powerful idea in American political thought, which may be more in accord with many individual Americans than what is a totalitarian ideology of communism, which is only going to end in tears. If you go down that path, it's going to be the path that leads to gross human rights abuses and your dreams being turned to ashes.
I think this is why it's always very difficult to talk about communist ideology, because I think very few people would honestly identify with Stalin or Mao. But I mean, I think this is why Orwell is so useful, because he really paints the picture of a communist society, like in Animal Farm, the horse, very much like, a good person believes in it and is worked to death by the party, essentially. And that reminds me of a book called Wild Swans. It was written by a Chinese woman who talks about like 3 generations of her family, 3 women in her family. And her father was very much like the horse. He was part of the communist revolution. He was one of the people who really believed in like, this is going to make society better. I want to be a part of this. I want to make things better for the Chinese people. And it just killed him working in the party. Like, because the people in charge were not thinking what he was thinking about what communism and social justice is.
Orwell is absolutely captures that extremely, extremely well, as a great author always does. Or Darkness at Noon, right? So Arthur Koestler's great, essentially novel of the Stalinist show trials that. All are very important. Or Milovangelis's Conversations with Stalin, right? That's nonfiction, of course, Yugoslav communist and the difficult relationship that the Yugoslav communists had with Stalin. So I think that there's a literature on those topics, and the individuals should look at that, and they should look at the history of communist thought and explore it. And ask themselves, why is it that this always goes wrong, right? Why is it that it comes in many guises and it exists empirically in many different places, many different cultures, many different locations across space and time, many, many differences, and yet it always ends up in the same way. And I think if you ask yourself, why is that the case, then you're on the search for alternatives, which would allow you to hold your principles and values, but recognize that a non-totalitarian option is going to be far better than communism.
So with all this talk as basically groundwork, now that I think we have a kind of hopefully a better idea of communist ideology, you co-wrote a book, How China Sees the World. So how does this ideology affect how the Chinese Communist Party sees the world and how it operates?
Well, it sees it it answers the questions that need to be asked really for every polity. Who are we, right? What are our objectives? What are we seeking to achieve? Who are our friends and who are our enemies? So ideology answers those big questions no matter where it is. And communist ideology does that, obviously, in China, and allows us to come to for the West, right, obviously answers which are very unpalatable. But for the 96 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, those answers are one which is we're moving forward, right? We're building a better China. That almost no one truly believes that, in the way that Mikhail Suslov was the last Bolshevik, right? He died in 1982. He was the guardian of communist ideology in the Soviet Union after Zindanov, right? I mean, essentially had passed the torch. He was an individual responsible for maintaining and resolving ideological disputes in communist parties that were friendly towards the Soviet Union. And so he truly believed it. But nobody in the Soviet Union believed other than Mikhail Suslov, believed the promises of the communists, even those within the Communist Party. Certainly the Brezhnev years or the Khrushchev years overthrew, if you will, established truth, and Brezhnev just resulted in a plateauing and gradual decline and decline in standards of living and expectations about the future and of the vitality of the Soviet system. Similar elements are there with the Chinese Communist Party. Many individuals might be in the Mikhail Suslov camp, true believers, and certainly at the top, and certainly Xi Jinping and his coterie, right, are individuals who truly believe that focus on the novel how the steel was tempered, right, on what is going to be generated, what the society they're seeking to create. But I would suspect that most are in the party because it's advancing their career, it's advancing the necessity of a privileged life that they would seek to advance, and the ability to influence individuals and the ability to build their own fiefdoms. So a complicated story, to be sure, but it's one which is extremely important. How do they see it? Well, they see the United States as the impediment to the world they want to create, the China that they want to create. If the United States were to disappear, if the West were to, they would be able to have the society that they want to have without external opposition. Internally, of course, you always have to safeguard because there are always bad ideas, pernicious ideas that are around, whether that's coming from a religious orientation or coming from a the West political orientation. You always have to police those ideas. There are always dangerous individuals who have to be dealt with harshly in these systems. So it's telling you how you deal with your enemies and how you should deal with them brutally, as well as who your enemies are and the world you're seeking to create. It also legitimizes why China, the PRC, should be the state, the entity that leads the future, right? Not the West, not the United States, but the common destiny of mankind, which Xi Jinping talked about very heavily a few years ago in terms of the future for all individuals on the planet Earth.
So based on what you're saying, there is no way the United States can engage with China.
Well, they can engage with it, but it's not going to change their behavior. I think that what we have here there was that great Frederick the Great line, right? You know, talking about, well, why did you fight a war over Silesia with Maria Theresa? Well, he said there wasn't any misunderstanding. We both wanted Silesia, right? It's a zero sum. Either she's going to have it, Austria's going to have it, or Prussia's going to have it. It's not, one or the other. So the communists are targeting the West. They have since they came to power, and that's not going to stop. And that is only changing communist ideology or evicting the CCP from power is going to abort really that ambition. If those elements are not done, yes, we're on a collision course. We're in a conflict that they have started and with which we must engage fully.
So how does the United States deal with this situation when the United States is not only facing attacks from the Chinese Communist Party itself, but is also operating under a society that has influence from the engagement school with China, this basically a different type of communist tradition in the West? How does the United States move forward?
You cut off their financing. Right, you don't allow them to raise money anymore in New York. You separate the Western ecosystem from the PRC's economic ecosystem. You wage political warfare effectively against them. They know they're illegitimate, right? Calling them out, working with the Chinese diaspora, with people in China to think through what would the right Chinese polity look like today. And how is it that you can move beyond this Western idea, this Western party, right? Communism is a Western ideology. How can you move beyond that to make something truly Chinese, something fully in accord with a polity, fully in accord with Chinese civilization. You simply just bypass the CCP, right? I mean, they're a product of the West. And what is a Western ideology doing governing China? China should be governed by the political principles divined from Taoist thought or Confucian thought as interpreted through modernity, not through a communist ideology. So effectively, providing an alternative and working to create that alternative while undermining their legitimacy at home, of course, and overseas. Are ways to effectively wage war against them. Thinking through about a post-communist China is a very valuable exercise, and it's one that would allow the greatness of the Chinese people to come to the fore. They're fettered by the CCP, right? If you could remove that fetter, think about what China could achieve. Think about the greatness, how much better China could be. For the Chinese people and for the diaspora, but also for the world. So there are many things that we can do to exploit the crisis that they have gotten themselves into, right, now that their economy is tanking.
So there is one part of China, let's say, that has higher living standards, more, liberal democracy, right? Which is
where he's going.
Right.
Okay.
Well, you know where I'm going with this, which is Taiwan, right? So
just so everyone doesn't get mad watching, Matt is not saying Taiwan is part of China.
That was
I don't
a
want
joke.
the thing where like half of India hates us because you said the CIA should overthrow.
I didn't say that. I said the CIA is bad. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point about Taiwan is that the Republic of China government that runs Taiwan has obviously it's a different ideology than the People's Republic of China. But what I want to ask really is sort of how does the Chinese Communist Party's ideology and the U.S. engagement school's view on China play into how we're going to handle the Taiwan issue?
Well, sadly, they reinforce each other to a degree. And so I'm convinced that the CCP will move against Taiwan to conquer it. Increasingly coercive measures are being played against Taiwan. And the engagement school, of course, is loath to recognize, I think, the danger that Taiwan faces from the CCP in the near term, in the immediate term. Still choosing to believe that more engagement is going to modify the behavior of the CCP. And so I think that the engagement school is giving us bad ideas and bad advice on that and is blinding people to the real danger that the Philippines, India, Taiwan face from aggression coming from the CCP immediately, that is today. So it's a very great danger to my mind.
So you said earlier that you feel like the Biden administration is sort of the last gasp of the engagement school. Do you think that is on its way out? Is it going to be, what is it going to be replaced with?
I think it's on it. Increasingly, businesses are recognizing, loath to admit it, but recognizing that China is a bad place for an investment. Dealing with the CCP is one which is not going to end well. They're going to, we could go through iPhone struggles right now, right? Huawei is establishing its alternative and Apple is going to be on its way out. Well, that's how many times has that been repeated? So a presence in the PRC is a really bad idea, and more businesses, I think, increasingly are going to move elsewhere, recognizing the danger of allowing them to raise capital on our markets. Also, if that spigot could be closed, I think that's going to be a very positive step forward. So what would the engagement school look like? I think it would break, ultimately, its dependence on China and recognize that the CCP was, in fact, everything they said it wasn't. But nonetheless, investments can flow to India, can flow to Indonesia, could flow elsewhere, or to the United States itself in order to permit the manufacturing of goods or to provide the investment that it needs. The engagement stool gradually is going to come around. Herbstein said, if something can't go on forever, it won't. Right, and this can no longer go on anymore. And the engagement school is going to recognize, I think, that it's folly in engaging the CCP, and then it's going to, as Gandhi said of the British, right, quit. He said quit India, right, but they're going to quit China.
And what do you think? Where do you think the U.S. government will go in terms of how it views China, the CCP?
I think increasingly the U.S. government is recognizing that the CCP is an existential threat to the United States, and I would say that is, if you will, turning the rudder. To use a nautical metaphor, I think is a good one. The rudder is changing; it is turning slowly. That's not to say that it can't turn back a little bit at some times, but the U.S. government is beginning to recognize U.S. national security community and elsewhere that the CCP is a very dangerous actor in international politics, and their ambitions are the opposite of ours. And so they're an immediate and direct national security threat to the U.S. and its interests.
Do you think it's important for the U.S. government or the media to talk about the weaknesses of China and the Chinese Communist Party?
Absolutely. I think it's, in a kind of an Oliver Cromwell, let's show the CCP warts and all. Right? Let's see what they actually do. And sadly, the abuse against Tibetans or abuse against the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz Muslims, right, or religious, or the abuse that the ordinary Chinese individual has to go through are not well identified in American media, and they should be. That we're still profoundly ignorant of the abuses of the CCP within China because they just don't want to look at it for whatever reason. And I think that more attention needs to be paid to that very important topic.
I'm still amazed that forced organ harvesting is not a bigger issue than it is.
Yes, right. When you begin to recognize that, or the Islamophobia of the CCP, and we can go down the list of their gross human rights abuses, but also the belligerence, and this belligerence is unchecked, it's unfettered, and so I think that we're going to see very rapidly Xi Jinping move using coercive measures and kinetic measures, warfare over Taiwan or in other areas as well. I think that's more and more people are waking up to the fact that the CCP is defined wherever it's present by exploitation of people and the environment. And the more that message gets out, I think the better it is.
Well, it's not just internationally. I think people in China, too, are beginning to realize, or have already known for a long time, but just feel more able to talk about it, that the Chinese Communist Party is bad.
Right. The blank page protests, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can see the disaster of zero COVID, and then blank page coming out of that shows that the CCP has created a world-class surveillance state where it's very difficult to have open communication, but smart people, of course, can get around that. Determined and very intelligent people can get around that temporarily, at least. But the blank page protest, I think, we'll see rekindled. Right? It's not a one-off, but I think this is other places, other locations is going to surface time again, particularly as the economy is now declining. So that implicit bargain, at least in Deng's mind, that he struck with the Chinese people, Deng Xiaoping's mind, right, that you're going to back us and we're going to make you rich, right, is failing.
So you talked about a post-communist China. What do you think would be the major driving force of that? Would it be internal pressures, or does the United States have to play a role? Is it some combination?
I think it would be very modest. The U.S. has a very modest role to play in that. I think it's going to be an internal. It's going to be the Chinese people. They're at an elite level and mass level who are going to come to their own, if you will, solution to the abuses of the CCP and free themselves from it. Again, it's that you can't. I think rule for so long with an imported ideology, right, which is grafted on to essentially in a Frankenstein monster type of structure to control the Chinese people. China has an incredible political tradition and political thought and political culture, and China needs to be governed in accord with those political principles and not with the tyranny of the CCP. So it'll be the Chinese people who do it. It won't be outsiders.
It makes me think about a lot of times what the CCP attacks as its enemies. One of the things that's, I think, not really understandable to many in America or the West, that like they would attack an organization like the National Endowment for Democracy so hard, where like you understand maybe why they attack NATO or why they attack the U.S. government generally, and they can criticize its hegemony. But something like the National Endowment for Democracy, which what do? They give grants to like civil society groups, and they teach like different civil society groups around the world about like democracy and how that system works, etc. And I think it's because the CCP has put so much effort and propaganda over the decades into brainwashing the Chinese people into believing that the CCP is the only system. Like this is the system. They kind of the way you said, the Frankenstein grafting, where like they try to put on the mantle of Chinese culture as if like, okay, the Chinese culture historically, we have all this great traditions and 5,000 years of history, and it has ended in the Chinese Communist Party, which without the Chinese Communist Party, there would be no new China, right? So the idea of letting people even question whether there could be another system or another way of doing it is just fundamentally so dangerous to their legitimacy.
I think that's exactly right. To my mind, that's exactly right. I mean, that's why they are walk on eggshells around those topics, because they know they're illegitimate, and they know that you can look at Taiwan, you could look at what Hong Kong was, or Macau, before they strangled them, and you could see that it doesn't have to be this way. It wasn't in China's past, and there are other countries where it's not, and in China's future, it won't be as well. But of course, the trick is getting there, right? That's devilishly hard, given that this is a surveillance superpower. But increasingly, to my mind, these guys are just out of gas, right? It's just like Mikhail Suslov is the last Bolshevik, and Xi Jinping is really the last adherent to that how the steel was tempered mindset, right? Of we're going to go and we're going to grab this society, we're going to turn it upside down, shake it, abuse it, mistreat it, those days are ultimately past, as the Chinese people recognized, and I think more in the West and more in the United States, even in the engagement school, are beginning to recognize that it's not good business, it's not good for the Chinese people, and it's time to consign these guys to the dustbin of history.
Well said. So for anyone watching, where should they go to learn more about what you do, your writings, your books?
Well, the Center for Security Policy .org. So Center for Security Policy as one word .org has most of my writings, and my books are available at Amazon. And Jim Fennell would hope to have in the not too distant future our book out, really looking at the question of how the United States worked to support the PRC's rise and how that could happen and what needs to be done now to reverse it. So I look very much forward to having with Jim, joining Jim and you again to address that topic.
I'm looking forward to that too. I think that'd be a very interesting conversation.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of things we probably want to talk about, to say after that interview. But first, before I forget, I just have to thank everyone from the previous podcast who wrote in and said the movie I was thinking of was Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive. I'm so happy to know what that movie is now. Thank you very much.
I feel like the three of us need to do movie night and watch that.
We could.
We could do like a Mystery Science Theater 3000.
The one I've been wanting to show you.
Uh-huh.
This is a deep cut for all of you. It's a movie called Hard Rock Zombies. It's a movie one of my friend's dad actually edited.
Okay.
Way back in the day. It's pretty.
Like how back in the day are we talking?
It was like 80s or maybe 90s.
Hard Rock Zombies.
Yeah, it's about this hard rock band and not really hard rock.
Okay.
They're on a America tour and they stop in this small town, and the small town it hates them. It's the kind of rock and roll is the devil's music, blah blah blah. So they stay in this creepy house, and then they become zombies.
Oh, they become
happens.
zombies. Okay, I didn't see that twist. I thought they were going to have to fight zombies.
There are some other twists in that movie that you would not see coming either.
Okay, well, great. Being that, you've also showed us The Room.
Mm-hmm.
They
The
Live.
Room is great. They Live is great.
The Happiness of the
Katakuris. That's a great movie.
Which we couldn't finish, and that night
I was
quit.
very disappointed by that.
That movie I did not like, but The Room was a lot of fun, and They Live was actually, I do think that was a great movie.
That is legitimately
classic.
A fantastic movie. That's not even it's not good like the way The Room is good. It's just a good movie.
It's the way The Room is good is that it's bad.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Yes, but man, when he puts on those glasses for the first time and then it's like the plot is revealed, like whoa! If you don't know that's coming, great moment in cinematic history. So, welcome to Movies Unreviewed. Yeah, maybe we should talk about the interview we just spent an hour doing.
I agree.
Yeah, I think what is so sinister about communism is how it can really lure people in with the promises of this utopia. And then when people buy into it, they get really offended. It's like, well, why are you saying this is bad? I just want this utopia. And they don't realize they're actually on the highway to hell.
I don't think it's even utopia. It's just I just want things to be better.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that Brad talked about the American origins of progressivism and the way progressivism was. That
it's something that, like you were saying about Chinese culture, communism is good at grafting things on.
Yeah, I think it's okay, they could take the mantle of progressivism or take the mantle of, Confucianism or whatever, and then it's hard to distinguish because, you get into, people get offended about things that you're not necessarily actually talking about.
Yeah, it makes it harder to, you don't even know what you're arguing about anymore.
Yeah, and I think that it is also hard for people to see the totalitarian end game, I guess, for I mean, it's easier to see it with Leninism or Stalinism, but I think you'd still even have people be like, well, Stalin was a bad guy. But if we had Trotskyist, communism, I think it's just hard to see that, ultimately, if you have the system the way it's set up, there has to be a powerful state that controls everything. That's just the way the system is set up, and it's not,
It's like a perfect system of redistribution of resources requires a perfectly powerful government that can handle all of that redistribution.
And also, you can't question it.
Right. And so, and this is fundamentally, I think, you look at, so this communist ideology infiltrates maybe an original progressive movement from the 19th century, where there are real abuses by the railroads or by, people in the state capital. But the solution isn't to have communism or to kill rich people and take their stuff. The liberal solution to that is to ensure a level playing field and allow for more competition, allow for individual liberties so that you can grow organically, and people can themselves compete with these powerful interests. So those interests become, by comparison, not so powerful anymore.
Yeah, it's that real focus on the individual rather than people as groups.
Right. And I think Brad made that point very well.
Yeah. I mean, that I think that's an issue a lot of people have, where they think all rich people are the enemy. And that's not true. There's like this narrow band of people who are rich who are the enemy. And that also includes people who are not rich who are the enemy. They're the dirty reds, Shelley.
Thank you for watching this episode of China Unscripted. I mean, like, what are we?
Well, I mean, we already lost everyone after the movie review. They were like, oh, they already are off the rails. We don't have to watch the rest.
You just have to watch the place where we're off the rails, and then you know it's over.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Well, no one's watching this now, so should we just all?
So you can just go ahead and say what we've been wanting you to say for years now.
Well,
Years.
Anyways, just so people understand what I was saying, there's like the enemies of society are people who want to establish totalitarian repressiveness. People I might call dirty reds, but other people might disagree with that terminology. But so it is not like if you are rich, you are bad, and if you are not rich, you are good. I guess even communists wouldn't say that, because there's like, the counter-revolutionaries and all those people.
Well, also China has more billionaires in its, elite political circle than any other country.
Yeah, but I mean, that is the difference between like a society where communism has taken over and a society where communism is trying to take over.
I mean, do I have to explain again why I'm not going to say anything you want me to say?
No, I think you're wrong. I think it's a great word, great terminology.
See, I actually agree with Shelley, but I still want to troll her.
Yeah, he still wants to egg me on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
this is my nature. I can't help it.
So you would rather commit like a strategic blow against your own best interests in order to just
you're
score
assuming
a
that
tactical...
that is what it is.
Yeah, no, that is what it is, and surprisingly, yes, I would like to do that. Yeah, no, it's kind of inexplicable, but that's my personality.
Okay.
That reminds me of my friend in college through a communist party.
Okay, like a party?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I showed up dressed as McCarthy.
Wow.
Oh, what a troll.
But describe the Communist Party to us.
It was a very loose idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
There was like a company that used to sell T-shirts of the Communist Party, and it was like Marx and Lenin and Stalin. They had like lampshades on their heads and like red Solo cups,
Oh, yeah.
You've seen that, yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like your friend's party wasn't quite so fun.
It was all right. I have that story to tell.
Mm-hmm. Did they appreciate the McCarthy cosplay?
I don't think they really got the flavor of it.
I think it says a lot about your personality, though.
That I'm a bit querulous.
Yes, that you would essentially go to troll your friend's party.
No friend of mine is a communist. That's what I said as I slammed my little red party cup on the ground after losing beer pong. Oh. Hey, good night. Thanks, everybody. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jog.
And I'm Matt Canesta.
I'll let you know what they think of Hard Rock Zombies. Good night.